Monotype.
Welcome to Creative Characters for Monotype, a show where we meet the people working at the intersection of type and everyday life. I'm your host, Cadley, and I'm here with the wonderful Charles Nix.
Hey, Cadley.
Hi, Charles.
It's so exciting to be recording with you for the first time. Every time I've done this before, it's been with Carl, and I'm really excited to have a fresh face and voice to guide us through this introduction.
Well, hopefully I can, keep up with Carl's witty banter. I'm not sure if...
I don't think any of us can.
This has been a big week for us and just a big week for, the type and design world. There's a lot going on. So how have you been?
I've been good. Yeah, like you said, it's been a momentous week, but I'm kind of want to say that it's always a momentous week in type because type is attached to everything in our culture. But this week in particular, the State Department is now recommending that the State Department documents be set in Calibri instead of Times New Roman. I mean, which to a type nerd like me is huge news. I've been contacted by multiple news agencies to comment on it. And of course, more importantly than that, the Monotype Trends Report for 2023 is dropped this week, and it's full of really great typography, including some work by the people I interviewed for our podcast.
Yes, yeah. So would you like to tell me about who you spoke with this week?
Yeah, I spoke with In-House International. I spoke with Michu Benham-Steiner and Lope Gutierrez-Ruiz. They are 2/3 of In-House International. Their partner Alex was not on the call. He's a little bit camera shy, so he sort of held back and let them carry the water. But they're great. I love them.
So yeah, how did you get to know them?
It's funny. I just mentioned the Monotype Trends Report. For last year's Trends Report, we included one of their typefaces. And I reached out to them to sort of say, hey, we're going to include you in the Trends Report. Are you cool with that? And they are cool. So they were, of course, cool with that. But it sort of started a little bit of back and forth. Then later in the year, I got to meet them in person at the brand new conference in Austin. And they were fantastic. And I wanted to know more about them. And there's obviously no better way to get to know somebody and talk about their design ethos than to sort of get them on the Creative Characters podcast, which we did.
I actually remember seeing them speak at Brand New, and I just feel like their vibrancy comes through, they have a very strong presence. So how does that translate to their work and their style?
Well, I think they represent to me the sort of, I'm realizing it's a kind of pattern that I've developed over the course of my professional career of collecting or getting closer to people who approach design in the way that they do. And I'll clarify that a little bit. It's that they approach design from the content first and the customer first. And style is completely irrelevant to the beginning of their process. So they're entirely invested in the content. And then as a result of their talent and a result of their process, they create really amazing styles. But they seem to shed those styles, like a snake sheds its skin. They seem to move on to the next thing right away. I mean, you can look at their website right now, and that's sort of the latest iteration of how they represent themselves. But I'm imagining that within 6 to 9 months, we'll see a completely different iteration of them. Similarly, the typefaces that they create are very much of the moment. I'm thinking specifically of last year's Ragtag, which is a really sort of interesting mix-up typeface where every character in the font has a completely different design. Or this year's Trends Report, which includes them again, contains their typeface Perfora, which is a much more sort of grid-based but incredibly flexible and vibrant typeface too. So I highly recommend that anyone who's listening to this, keep listening to me, but go out onto their website and then go over to My Fonts and look at Ragtag and Perfora and all of the other typefaces like Pataslab and Troptical and Broker. They're really cool.
Love it. Yeah, I think that their typeface Perfora for the Smart Grid and the Type Trends is probably my favorite branding piece that we have in there. So
yeah, they're on fire. It's great. And they're great people. Really fun to talk to.
Thanks so much, Charles. I'll hand it over to you and Michu and Lope.
So hello, everybody, and welcome to Creative Characters. I'm Charles Nix, and I'm so lucky today to be joined by Lope Gutierrez-Ruiz and Michu Benham-Steiner from In-House International. I know some of your broad biographical details, but I would love to know more specifics.
We're both from Venezuela, from, roughly speaking, the capital city, and that is also where Alex is from. by way of London. He couldn't join us today, but we met when I was living abroad in London. Lope and Alex were working in a magazine in Venezuela that was about youth culture and emerging talents. And we connected over that magazine. This is like early odds. They had this really neat sort of like flip book feature that I wanted to steal for a magazine I was making in college. And I could not figure it out. And eventually I just contacted them to be like, can you tell me how you did this? But also in the process, really read the magazine, loved it, connected with them, tried to get them to have me as a contributor. They were like, you're in Chapel Hill. We don't care about Chapel Hill. But then I went to London and then they cared about London. So that's how we all connected.
Lope, is that how you remember it?
Yeah. Basically, the magazine had a number of foreign correspondents, and Michu was our correspondent in London, which is funny because, like Michu mentioned, the studio has 3 partners, Alex, Michu, and Lope, and Alex is originally from England. He's now living in Barcelona. So there's this English connection through the history of the previous magazine. I will say that Michu was by far the best correspondent the magazine had. And when she went to South America, to Venezuela, to visit her relatives, we finally met in person, all of us. And very quickly, the idea to do something of our own, Alex, Michu, and Lope, was very quickly developed. And I don't know if you want to take it from here, Mitch.
Sure. So, I mean, it took a few more years after that. There was a very short-lived music blog from around the world. Also, Alex is a DJ when he's not designing type and brands. He's a fantastic DJ. But the one thing that I had as a person being abroad and being brought up in Venezuela was that both in the US and then in my experience in London, it became very clear that the art scene had one set of rules for things happening in Europe and things happening in the US and Canada and maybe Australia to some degree, and a completely different set of perceptions when it came to everywhere else. And so it was like, here we make cutting edge art, and at the, in other places in the world, including Venezuela, South America in general, it's folk arts and crafts and nothing that spoke to the kind of cutting edge stuff that we knew because we were from there, that was coming out of there. So that's where the origin of the magazine came from. And that is where we decided we would focus our collaboration between the 3 of us. It would be in English so that we could access people making exciting things everywhere. And then that served us well after, the magazine was no more, after it had sort of metamorphosized into a design studio, because, you get much more novel, creative perspective if you look at it with a broader lens.
And I should add that one of the first things that happened when building that magazine was that we wanted to cram as many collaborations as possible in every page, in every article. So we came up with this idea of having every title of every article designed by a different typeface foundry, a different designer, studio, etc. So it will be a feature about an Argentinian writer written by a Colombian journalist with the typeface design done by a Chilean guy and the illustrations done by a Brazilian graffiti crew. So it was all about cramming as much as possible. And the magazine had like side notes that were footnotes that were written in the voice of the magazine. So it was insane. It was an insane amount of collaboration and things crammed in that. And that was clearly the beginning of our ethos as a studio, yeah.
So it's like, how many people can we put in here? That's it.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's sort of, I mean, it's a very 21st century thing to be as concerned with the object itself as you are with curation as a form of creativity. Collaboration and curation going hand in hand. You sort of mentioned in passing that the magazine became a design studio, which is a hilarious sort of turn of phrase, but something I think that's core to the way that you guys evolved. And I wonder if you just talk to that a little bit.
We had this magazine, and having a magazine, it turns out, is a bit of a economically funny, especially if you're trying to make something very crafted in very limited quantities. Like advertising, turns out, is not like the greatest thing for people to do with their advertising dollars with a magazine that has like such a small run. But the design of the magazine definitely got a lot of attention. And so every so often we'd get a question about like, oh, how'd you find this person? Or like, do you know this person and could you connect me? Or the magazine is so cool, who designed it? And so Lope was like, well, look, the ads aren't really working. And then we were at this...
The launch party.
Yeah, we were at this launch party for one of the issues, and that was being hosted by a gallery, and the gallery owner, Sonia Dutton, had invited this man, Stephen Dilly, who was about to open a pizzeria, and he needed a brand. And Lope and him ended up chatting for a long time, and then by the end of the night, we're just like picking up all the beer cans, and we get home, and he goes like, I think we should just have a design studio as a way to fund the magazine. And I think at the time, there was the Church of London and Little White Lies.
Correct.
Right, the magazine. They had that model, and so we're like, well, why don't we do that? And it was a little nerve-wracking because we're like, what? We don't know the first thing about running a design studio, but now we do, I guess.
Well, I mean, in terms of background in design, was the magazine your sort of college, or does Alex have a deep background in design? Where does the aesthetic and sort of the training, if any, come from for launching a design studio?
Alex is a trained designer, and we were trained informally.
If you want to go academic, our academic backgrounds are in the social sciences and like humanities. Mm-hmm. So we were trained to be curious about the world and be journalists. And that curiosity translated quickly into visual curiosity. So our sort of evolution was like from journalists to editors to publishers to art directors. We all sort of like met very quickly, actually, in years. It only took some years to all of us to land into visual culture or art direction as a way to communicate. So it became very natural to us.
I mean, having met the two of you in person a couple of times, I get the sense of in-house as you two and a silent partner who I've not met. And so the 66% that I know is, to me, a really attractive kind of design. That is one, like you said, fueled by curiosity first, which is the best aspect of the best designers. And, given the best designers that I taught as a teacher, they always seemed to come from backgrounds that weren't related directly to design. They were ones who were, curious and a microbiologist, curious and a psychologist, curious and a philosopher. And so what you guys have in your resume, non-design wise, really appeals to me as designers. And the fact that you make great looking work really helps. Tell me a little bit about growing up in Venezuela and, your time there, what let you know it was time to go, and if you have any plans to go back, I suppose.
It was a great place to grow up, and I think because of how old both Lope and I are, it was a great place to experience growing up. It has a long Caribbean coast. The capital city is separated from the most incredible beaches you can imagine by a mountain range, and so it's like this valley right next to the Caribbean. It's fantastic. And, everything you can imagine, the tropical birds, the 100 million days of sunshine, the perfect weather, all of that is true, the beautiful, lush vegetation. And there was a lot that I got to enjoy of the city and its cultural offerings and its public spaces as I was growing up. And then it kind of turned as I was turning into a teenager, which was terrible timing for me, because all of a sudden, when freedom became more possible, then it became a much more dangerous place to live in. It was also getting really politically charged, and all of that contributed to what ended up being reasons we left.
So Venezuela, as an oil country, hit riches it really grew us economically in the 1970s and 60s. And the environment, is like what Mitchell mentioned, lush, green, Caribbean, amazing. But the sort of prevalent graphic design culture, because of immigration factors and other things that I don't want to go too much into them, was deeply minimalistic. So we had this clash of every single logo or graphic image. Everything was Helvetica. Everything was like monochrome, super clean, sans serif. Even the architecture was like concrete, clean form, angular, a massively developed subway system that was all with an extremely well-designed wayfinding, things like that, the Swiss style. That was the sort of clashing visual cultures that we grew up with. Alex in particular, he went to a sort of like a German school, and then he went to Graphic Design Institute that was called the Neumann originally. And so this influence of like Bauhaus functionality was day-to-day like graphic, even the logos on TV, everything was like influenced by this. And it was in direct contrast to our lush mangoes and parrots everywhere. And it really influenced like the way that we all, the three partners, see the world.
But it was sort of tropicalized geometries, I think.
Yeah.
I
love that.
So you can't just keep the cold grades and everything. It's not that warmth is chaos. It's more that the tropics bring an equally strong and undeniable force, and the combination ends up being very interesting, where the confluence of those two things meet.
But you see this as a sort of productive friction? I mean, the sort of external influence of Swiss style design and the sort of...
I don't know if I can judge it retrospectively as a productive friction, because I don't know to the detriment of what.
Right.
It's just like you don't really expect Hawaii to be designed by Joseph Müller-Brockmann. It's not like, so that was sort of what it was for us. Yeah.
Well, when you left Venezuela, Lope, you went first to London. Michu, you went to Chapel Hill, or was it not that direct?
I left for college and I was able to get a scholarship in Chapel Hill. So I went to college. And in college, they were like, you can study abroad. And I was like, abroad. Great. I'm leaving for London. And that is where I connected with Lope and by extension with Alex. But I went back to Venezuela, and then we left together once the magazine was off the ground. And we landed in Austin the end of 2010.
2010. Okay. So just a dozen years ago. How did you get started with the magazine, Lope? And did you ever end up in London?
Yeah, I've been to London several times, but to make a long story short, and everything goes back to Michu. We had this insane idea, let's make a magazine that is in English, distributed in the US, people from all over the world, while we were basically living in a dictatorship. And we just started designing the magazine, asking for collaborations, using all of our contacts without any way to fund or make this thing happen. And it was just, in the back of our heads, like we eventually got to figure out how to print and ship this. And Michu one day comes and says, I just saw this thing, a tweet about this new thing that might be interesting. It's called Kickstarter. And he had like 20 projects on his homepage. It was like the very first days. And I was like, that's clearly a scam, Kickstarter. Just look at the name.
And you had to be invited and everything.
You had to be invited, and Michu sent them an email, and she convinced them. I think we were one of the first 100 projects. You want to tell what happened once we were on Kickstarter, Michu?
It worked. We got funded, but one of the reasons that we got funded fairly quickly is that kind of a future millennial marketing consultancy saw the magazine as a great way to send it to their big name clients for Christmas, I guess. And so they bought out the issue, at least a big chunk of the print run. And then we get this list of addresses, and we're like, creative director at Nike and da 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 da. We're like, well, that's pretty lucky. That'll be very easy to like set up advertising for the next issue. Turned out it wasn't quite as easy, but sometimes when luck like that strikes, it is very encouraging, and it emboldens you to make big leaps like, F it, we'll move to the States and do this for real.
So then why Austin? And I mean, not only in terms of getting there, but sort of staying there and what it means to you now, because Austin's a very different vibe in the US than practically anywhere else. But I'd love to hear it through your words and experiences. What is it about Austin?
I mean, the real story, and I think we've told this to a few people now, but is that we looked around, we Googled. We didn't want to end up in Miami because we didn't want to have to drive. And there were a lot of people from Venezuela migrating to Miami. And we felt a vibe that was a little bit like, kind of 1 foot there, 1 foot here. And we didn't want that. We wanted to sort of establish a kind of a new home. And to print the first magazine, we'd both been working. Like Lope had a correspondent job, he had a day job, and I had a day job and was doing this nights and weekends. And so we wanted somewhere we could afford, because it was just like, the currency there and the currency here are very different and afford very, very different things. So we knew New York was out. We knew the big expensive cities were out. And that might sound funny now because Austin is not inexpensive, but it was relatively at the time. And the thing that sort of made the decision final was it's warm, it has a large sort of Hispanic, Latino component, and it's close to Latin America. And at the same time, it is a city that we thought did not require cars. And that was that was false. That was not good information that we got. But by the time we were here and realized that the bus system was not going to be a practical way to lead the entirety of our lives, we had already made friends. And Austin was, and I think still is, a very friendly and personable place. And we were coming from a city that was really dangerous. And here there was no such thing. People didn't lock their doors. It was nuts. So we were hooked. We got a car.
Do you both have driver's license? And yeah.
I learned to drive in Austin. Yeah. I drive like a maniac. And I will say that when we moved, just a quick anecdote, that when we told our friends back in South America that we were moving to Austin, they were like, what's Austin? And we're like, the capital of Texas. And they were like, oh, it's pronounced Houston. But yeah, because nobody knew what Austin was back in 2000, early 2000s. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was a time, well, it was probably a critical time. You guys were there. You were probably part of why Austin sort of hit the map culturally. I mean, you were in it when it took off.
It's been a very exciting
decade,
yeah.
Me Too, particularly, was the motor, the engine behind doing launch parties and events and collaborations. I remember when we did the thing with teleportal readings.
That's right. We hit the ground running because we came to Austin. That was the other thing. We didn't know anyone. We just knew the internet was like, no cars, it's warm and it's cheap. And so we were here. But then we started walking around downtown and being like, that's a museum. Let's go in there and meet all the people at the museum. And that is basically how we connected with people. And then we asked them to get us, to tell us who else we could meet. We were just doing this kind of like introduction tour, which is really a very big plus of having a publication, that there is reason to talk to just about everyone.
Correct.
So the collaboration was the magazine published fiction and short fiction because it's a magazine. And there was this series called Teleportal Readings, which was kind of like, they explained it as like reading Rainbow for adults, but essentially it was, they would pair an animator and a fiction writer, and the fiction writer would read their story aloud, and an animator would turn it into an animation, and then they would play it at this, live event. And we kind of talked to them and came up with the idea of together doing one in translation. So that was a fun thing we got to do, but it also was helpful down the line, which I think within 6 months we were doing animations for design clients.
I want to talk about Alex a little more since he's not here, but to sort of get to the international part of in-house. I mean, the contradiction to me in the name is hilarious, and probably not as hilarious to you, but it's an international design firm centered in Austin, Texas, which I think to most people are not thinking like London, New York, LA, Austin. But I love this idea of a sort of international design studio centered in Austin. And I can see, having talked to you, or I can hear, having talked to you, how you do that. But I would love for you to describe the way that in-house is international.
I mean, the most obvious way, or I guess the most straightforward way, is that the three people in it were based internationally and also out of their houses. And that was the first sort of embodiment of it. I thought it was hilarious, and I pushed for this terrible SEO, like SEO wise, it's like a terrible name. But I was like, it's so funny because we're at home, but it's like everywhere, at home, everywhere. And then for a while there, it just was a long name that we would say, and nobody really felt like they got the joke. And then we got an office, and then it was no longer in-house, but we were really interested in the idea that we would work really intimately with clients. And that's kind of where the interesting balance came along. And then that was kind of chapter 2, working very closely with clients as if we were their in-house team. And our clients weren't even necessarily in Austin. They would be in New York. And we didn't really fly out to see them very much. We just worked remotely from the start because we were like, why not? And so we would work with Alex, who was at the time in Venezuela, but we, would pick up people in Argentina or in Croatia or in Australia, all over the place that we would find and start working with. And that is kind of how we projected ourselves internationally. The third is more recent. And I think maybe like the least of the kind of international part of it is, as the studio grew, we grew as in evolved or learned more or got more sophisticated. We've started doing more and more strategy, which I think is an important, like a very crucial part of branding. And we evolved from doing mostly design and editorial to doing more branding. Strategy comes with that. And then 2021, we did our first project where we were completely immersed in a company doing their entire sort of strategic framework. And we were actually literally in-house. Maybe less international. We were actually there.
And which customer or client was that?
That was a company at the time called Aunt Bertha. It is now called Find Help, and they do social care technology to connect people to the social safety net.
And I should interject here because Michu is just too humble and she's not going to say it herself. Basically, for this project, Michu was like the VP of marketing of this organization, and she established the very first like marketing and design department. And that was like the true spirit of the studio of being in-house was manifested in this project. And when she came, she did all the hiring, design of the setup of the department for the future, but also changing the name of the company, which you can imagine is a huge task. And all these actions, the project lasted 6 months. And I don't know, Michu obviously not going to say it herself, but the amount of thinking and a strategy that you have to do when you're setting this for forever, including the establishment of this department, was amazing. I was really mind blown, by the work.
Thank you.
Oh,
that was
it was awesome. It was awesome. Yeah.
But I think it was also very cool to be internal in that I had access to executives and standing meetings with leadership at the company, which really does move things along, and having that kind of buy-in or access to buy-in and not a kind of having to ask for appointments from the outside, like, please, 15 minutes, let me explain, but rather, having like a main line to the client and the company by being in it, I think is kind of this act 3 of in-house. And it's something that we've started to do more of in smaller configurations, as opposed to like going all in and just doing that for 6 months. It was a big leap, but also experiments are kind of how we move ourselves forward as a studio.
Yeah, I wonder with that sort of long engagement, did you ever feel at any point that you were losing yourselves as a studio?
Oh, no, it was extremely structured precisely because we are not a humongous studio, and it was myself and 3 other people. And then our design team rallied around the design components of it. But then Lope runs a completely different arm of the studio, which is nonprofits and arts and education. And the studio kept taking on client work throughout, except I was essentially over there. Logistically speaking, it was a bit of an undertaking, but it was also very important to me that we hit every deadline for that project, because I knew I had this very rigid end date, because I had to return to the studio and start on new projects that I had already committed to.
And I would like to add something to what Michu was saying, that I think it's very important about the structure of our studio, and that really manifested positively in this project. As Michu mentioned, like not only has the studio was remote since the beginning, but we actually encourage our designers, our team members to move around, to not stay like in one city. You want to live in Vietnam for a couple of months, do it, etc. And that has become something in which every single member of the studio is immersed in a different visual culture, seeing different things every day. So the creative, the actual ideas and the approach to problems is very different from somebody who's like in Tokyo every day versus somebody who's in Barcelona or in Austin. And that different ways of looking at the world, both from a graphical visual standpoint, but also from a societal approach, I think it really, really pays off in this kind of like complex projects. Yeah.
And there was this point when we were just sort of starting off as a studio pretty seriously, that Austin became this kind of center of deep Americana, right? Mm-hmm. Everything was very Little League vibes. Mm-hmm. And we had no idea what that was first. And I mean, we knew how to recognize it, but it wasn't something that was an intimate reference for us. So everything that we were bringing in, even this first pizzeria, was just like, it looked very different than these like pennants and, you know, like athletic lettering and
scripty typefaces and
like nostalgia core of the early 2010s.
Mm-hmm. I think of Austin, and you may think of it differently living in Texas, but I think of Austin as almost like what Berlin was in East Germany in the middle of the last century, the sort of island of something other in the middle of this much larger thing. And Texas is not Austin, but Austin is the capital of Texas. Do you ever feel any tension that way between what is Austin and what is Texas?
Yes and no. I think less and less. I think Austin is sometimes feeling like it's becoming more Texas. But there's also other big cities in Texas that don't feel like the rural idea of Texas that people have in mind. The thing that Austin had that always set it a bit apart is that, yes, the seat of government, but it also has this university that is exploring much further than just, you know, what the main industries of Texas are. It's still a creative hub, but it also loses some of its creative hub potential when it becomes unaffordable for people not working in industry. I think that's why that tension is maybe slackening.
So when we were preparing one of our trends reports, I think last year, right, we saw suddenly that people were putting together lots of sort of mixed up different type forms in order to tell the story, an old story, but a new story to a lot of sort of mainstream America or mainstream culture, even globally. This idea that when you mix things up, it may at first appear to be chaos, but then you begin to find the beauty in the combinations. Mm-hmm. That is, we could typographically represent this idea of diversity and inclusion and ambiguity and all of this sort of like idea of differences coming together to be a whole. And then I saw that you guys actually had a typeface, which seemed very prescient, like that there would actually be a typeface that was pre-mixed up for people. And we included it in the trends report, but then anytime we include a fellow type designer in the trends report, I feel compulsion to reach out and say, hey, listen, we're going to talk about you and your typeface. Is that cool? And sometimes it's not cool. Like some people are like, I don't want Monotype talking about my typefaces. But to my great pleasure, you guys wrote back and you were completely on board with it. And that was my first interaction with you, and it made me happy and want to know you more. And then we bumped into each other at Brand New in Austin, and all that sort of long-winded storytelling to sort of get to, you guys also make typefaces.
Yeah.
They're very cool and very charismatic and very sort of, they seem to be always just slightly ahead of their time. But yeah, talk about your type.
The story of the Type Foundry is really much not unlike the story of the magazine, which is not unlike the story of the first magazine, which is I think part of why Alex and Lopene work so well together is because our panic compulsion is very much the same one, which is when things get scary, we like, you know, how octopus just kind of inks its way out of danger. We like make something that seems really impractical, but something that is very creative and we're very curious about and we wanted to do for a long time, but couldn't find reason to. So we'd been making custom type treatments for a very long time. We'd done them for logos. We'd done them for brand projects. We'd done them for, like, for example, I'm just like bringing this one up because this is something where, you know, the cover was made custom and then we contacted a bunch of type designers.
You should say what it is because this is radio.
Oh, sorry, this is radio. So this was a little booklet. We got an opportunity to go in the TED conference gift bag, but we got a very short period of time to do it. So we're like, okay, let's run and make a booklet. I should say that it's a non-comprehensive look at contemporary Latin American creativity. So type has been typically a part of our toolkit that we manage, that I think we manage very enthusiastically. And so the Type Foundry was something that was kind of unspoken for a very long time. There was no reason to do it. And then the pandemic hit and we did our octopus thing and got together. And this was maybe April of 2020. And Alex and Lope and I were like, you know, maybe it's time. Maybe this is the time to do it. We might not have any clients in 2 months. And this is something we wanted to do for a very long time. And then we reached out to Rodrigo Fuensalida in Chile. And he was super on board because we were like, well, you know, we wanted to know how technically like stretchy we could make our type ambitions.
And Rodrigo was on that book that you just showed called Nuevo Mundo Nuevo. Michu found, and Alex, they found Rodrigo's work and we were delighted by it. So that's the beginning of that collaboration with Rodrigo, who's like our
who's like our enabler of insane variable technical dream making, because he enables us to come up with insane ideas that push the boundaries of variable type. And that is something that he never shies away from and says like, oh, that's impossible or too hard.
I'm starting to see In-House International as a sort of creative pyramid scheme. Where maybe like you guys approach design in the strategic way where you're like, well, let's try something new. Now let's find people who are willing to try something new on our behalf or with us and be partners with us.
Yeah.
That's where I want to be.
Any excuse to connect with creative, cool people is always like, but if that's the pyramid scheme, then yes.
Totally.
And I'll say the very first typeface that was produced that you sort of alluded to is called Ragtag. And every single character is completely different. And I will add something about Alex. He has this tendency to modularity. He's very interested in every single system that he develops is so thorough, so exact. And when he and Michu were developing and Rodrigo were doing the very first sketches of ideas of a Ragtag, it was like, okay, let's make every single glyph different, but it needs to be engineered in a way that it really works well together, down to the negative space, to the morphology of the letters. Each one of them is completely different. It references different aspects of visual culture, but they all had to be engineered in an obsessive way so they could work together.
That's a really good thing to call out. So, and this is maybe very much a thing that Alex gravitates toward, the shape features of type and the ability to use typography as building blocks. So he does gravitate a lot toward modularity. There's a lot of typefaces that we've developed and published that are very much about stacking, and they do have these sort of stackable properties, and that is something that seems to recur. So the kind of the graphicness of type that gets developed is one thing, but it's also because of the nature of why the project came to be, why the Foundry exists, that it is an expressive outlet for us, but it's also much more graphical than it is about just writing. It's a lot more expressive than it would be if it were body text type.
Right. Well, I want to encourage people to go and look at all of your types. They can see it on in-house on your website. They can also look you up on MyFonts. Is there anywhere else they should be poking around if they want to see you?
Sure. You Work For Them has them as well. And then we write the stories that go with them, because that is one place where we can just flex our stylistic muscles and our wanting to create stuff that is an expression of its time or a wish that we have for the creative community. So this last one is very much like, it has kind of toy-like vibes, and it's very playful, and it's not super moody. And our hope is that, and it stretches horizontally and vertically. The name is Perfora. And so it's doing really well. And sometimes that coincides with the fact that we maybe have landed on something, on some kind of collective feeling. And that's basically what it's all about. But it also differs very much from the way that we do strategy and work with clients, where we do shy away from having a style that is as recognizable. So it allows us to then, kind of show what we do in the absence of a strategic requirement, without sort of conscribing ourselves to a style as a studio that helps clients.
Right. Or you should describe that a little bit more. It is one of your precepts as a design studio, is that there is no definable style. Graphic design sort of thrives on style, but you guys seem to create them and shed them as quickly. Talk about why.
It's almost like the big irony is that when we work with a client to create a brand, consistency is what will help them build their recognition. But if we do that, it is to the detriment of clients, because if we are, sort of recycling our own style on our clients, it does very much come into conflict. I mean, unless there's, it's this kind of thing where a stopped clock is right at least once a day. Unless that coincidence happens to be seamless, for the most part, our style is about what we feel comfortable with. But what the strategic needs of our clients are might completely differ from what our style is. So by not establishing a style that we are, that is these guys, we come into the conversation not having a preconceived notion of what it is that we do for clients. We're not the people who do pastels and sans serif logos. We are the people who come in with a kind of a common sensibility to what is the goal and how can we be really intentional about helping your company or your project or your nonprofit be understood by the people that it needs to reach, and connect with them in an emotionally relevant way, whatever your context is.
I will say, because of our background, it's not even that we don't have a visual style. It's like we are firmly against having a recognizable visual style, because we feel it will be a failure if somebody looks at a logo that we built for a company and they think, that's In-House International. They should that is immaterial for the brand. And because our backgrounds are so diverse and we have such an appetite or a curiosity that is never satisfied, the idea of repeating ideas, the idea of recycling concepts or something like that is just completely against our nature. And, like I mentioned before, everybody's in a different visual culture. So it really comes as everybody's trying to bring, their creativity to every project in a way that the collage of the sort of solution that we arrive at the end is a mix of a very global, but at the same time, very, research-based. And I was thinking about this recently, Michu. I think that in a sort of way, that without having like a formal sort of way to say it, we sort of have some future casting or future trending work that we do, in which we always are thinking, okay, this is the environment, the context in which the brand exists today, but how is it going to be in 3 years, in 5 years, etc. And that really informs our work, not what's happening right now, not the environment of this Americana design in Austin, but also what's going to be down the line and the ecosystem in which you're going to coexist.
I mean, your portfolio of work speaks for itself, but then how do you take a customer or client on that journey of, we don't know what this is going to look like, we don't know where we're going to end up? That's a leap of faith for them, and one that you guys are accustomed to, but probably they aren't. So how do you coach them through that?
I think that the coaching is the major invisible part of the work of being a studio, and that's that is among the things that made us become a studio for real, as opposed to people pretending to run a studio, which is the coaching of clients is necessary, but also guiding people through a process is what determines whether the work will succeed or not. And so it's not necessarily like, oh, we are going to work together to make you something cool. We don't know what it is. It's more like there are strategic goals here. We're very much going to focus on those, how we measure those. How do we know if it's successful? Who the audience is? How do we find them? Do we test? Like, when do we test if we do test? What are the perceptual gaps? Like, what are you trying to achieve now? And then where do you see this going in the future? And having that common understanding that we are working in a language that we know how to create towards a goal that they define and that we understand together. We work in the language of strategy. We work in the language of marketing. We work in the language of those goals, and we are able to articulate why this is the way to go. The one kind of crucial conversation to have in the beginning, and I think this is one that is always very important to get right, is to talk with a client even before we've ever signed anything, to say, like, any work we create is to a goal, and that goal is not that you personally like it. Unless this is like a wedding invitation, this is not ever the goal. And it is not that we personally love it. It is that it does the job. And so that we can both be on board that you might have very effective work that you personally would not consume, and that you would personally not have a preference for, and that you need to get through that bias when you evaluate. And then we create really kind of structured rubrics for that evaluation. How well does it fit these three goals? How useful is it to the marketing managers of these three verticals that you're going into? So it ends up being very much like a process that looks very little like, how do you like this? And a lot more like a strategic transformation engagement.
Yeah. And we mentioned this in the talk, that a key component of this is honesty. And honesty is not only about, like what Mitch mentioned, about the goals the project has, but it's also about assessing the level of design education that the client has. Mm-hmm. So we need to structure our communication with the client, whether they know what a sans serif is or whatever. That's one part. But the second part is like, what's actually going to happen to the design after we leave? Like, do they have the capacity, the capabilities to actually execute this brand after we have left the building? But going back a little bit to the history of the studio, there was a before and after in the history of our studio, when we were like this young enterprise swinging logos and making magazines, etc. And we're not making a lot of money. And Michu said, like, how are we going to be successful about this? And she took one for the team, and she did an MBA, went to Stanford and took a class that was basically, it has one of those weird academic names like management of resolution driven, blah, blah, blah. But it was just how to have difficult conversations. And that gave us the tools to be able to have the difficult conversation about, like, you don't know, dear client, you don't know what a fake italic is. Like, you're so you need to trust us on this one. It's a lot about that, of having an honest conversation about what needs to happen. And that is difficult. And I sometimes, when we speak to our fellow people in the design community, it is always a topic.
Right. And it really does help set the tone for, what are we doing here and how are we doing it together? And hopefully if we pull it off correctly, then it's, there is always the potential for a design relationship. If we are successful in having that conversation and setting a framework, then we get to become allies together. And maybe not all the work speaks personally to each of us, but if it speaks in the language of the customer base they have, or their audience, or the group that they're trying to attract in a way that is compelling, that is memorable, then that is who we are making this for. And so the sooner we can take our own personal biases out of the process, generally the smoother the design process becomes.
Well, I hope that a lot of people listen to this, and I hope that they take the last sort of section very much to heart, because you described a great deal of the ethos of what you do in very frank and honest terms. And it sounds almost philosophical or business-like or prescriptive, but the result of it is that it frees up this sort of creativity that I think your work in its final form really displays in spades. So I pray that people will sort of look at your website as a libretto to this conversation.
Thank you.
And I pray doubly that we get to talk more in the coming months and years, because I really enjoy you two, and I love the work that you do.
Oh, thank you so much. You also do great work, man.
Wasn't fishing.
But you caught one.
There you go. Well, I learned a lot. I'm always pleased to talk to you guys, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again. Thank you guys so much. Until next time, take care.
Thanks for listening. In-house has a lot going on. Check out everything they're working on at their website, weareinhouse.com, or over at their Instagram @weareinhouse. As always, look for a link to our blog post in the show notes of this episode, and check out monotype.com/podcast to read about all of our prior guests. If you've been enjoying our podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify to rate and review this episode. If you really like us, subscribe to the show and share us with your friends. Creative Characters is brought to you by Monotype. It is produced by Christopher Olin, Mia Sullivan, and Marie Tabarez. We will be back with more episodes soon. See you next time.